my very best friend had gone to Amherst College, and he, after work, became a salesman for Avon Books in the Northeast. And as such, he periodically would drop off books he thought I'd be interested in. And I had developed pneumonia in January of 1977, about a year and a half after I'd graduated from Hampshire. And he came into my room and threw a paperback version of David McCullough's The Great Bridge on my bed. It was the story of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And he said, this is something you'd like. And I was actually kind of insulted that he thought I was just some history guy. I don't know why he thought that or why I would feel insulted. But I read it in one sitting, and it was fantastic. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to do a documentary film that was not only what McCullough did, the story of the construction, but also appreciate this bridge as an icon. So there would be a two-part film. And I was then 22, 23 years old. I looked like I was 12, and I started to go out and try to sell people the Brooklyn Bridge. And most of them thought a film about a bridge, this should be 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, that's what they thought it should be. That's what films about bridges, that's how long they were. And I've said, no, I don't know how I could keep it to an hour. It was this incredibly dramatic story. And not only that, I wanted to tell the story of the construction. I wanted to do it with first-person voices. I had this idea that why have just a single voice of God narrator when you could have first-person voices reading newspaper accounts or letters or diaries or journals that could help bring alive. They would read it off camera. And then rather than hold old photographs at arm's length, which is what everybody did, why not go inside them to the reality that my still photographer teachers had reminded me these suggested. And so that old feature filmmaker in me was awakened, that each photograph represented a long shot, the master shot, a filmmaker would say, from which one could do the long, the medium, the close, the extreme close-up, the pan, the tilt, the pull-out, the zoom-in, whatever it was. And so I found myself putting up photographs on an easel system that we invented, a 2x4 with a groove in it, a piece of metal, and got magnets from the hardware store. And we'd go into archives, painstakingly, one at a time, wearing gloves, and put up a photograph, and then go inside that photograph with our camera on a tripod with close-up lenses and will it alive. And then once we got into the editing room to use period music and complicated sound effects, you know, it was the euphemism of a documentary film that it was just one single effects track, if at all, the tramp, tramp, tramp of Nazi soldiers going through Paris. That was it, a distant gun going off. We wanted complex things, and indeed when I finished the film, I think it's still probably the highest compliment I ever got. We had the premiere at the Brooklyn Museum, and there was a lady in the audience, and she said, wherever did you get the footage, the film of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge? And I said, ma'am, it was built between 1869 and 1883. There was no motion picture. She goes, no, 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 I saw the footage. And I said, well, we did use later on in part 2 footage that Edison had shot in 1900 on a long completed bridge. She goes, no, 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 I'm talking about the boats that brought the big blocks of stone in and the derricks that lifted them up and all of that film. And I said, ma'am, those were still photographs. And she looked at me and she said, no, they weren't. And they were, and that to me was the opening up of the possibility of what we could do with history. That the first-person voices, the sound of the seagulls, the water of the East River lapping at these scows, the sound of the hiss of a steam generator helping the hoist, the sound of the winches, the tension of ropes, the shouts of men, the dozens of sound effects that we had added, the dramatic narrative fashion in which we had tried to tell the story, took it away from the onus then of most documentary films that at least were historical, that they were somehow homework, you know, castor oil, something was good for you but hardly good tasting, into something that could be not only informative but entertaining. Well, it was very interesting. I went to him, and at first he turned me down. You know, he, I guess, had his own interests. There were people who were interested in making a feature film, and he was advised by agents, I guess, that not to do it. But eventually, I just persevered, and he called me up one day and said, I hear the footage is great. He came up. He was thrilled that his bridge had been so beautifully filmed. We shot it over 2 years in every time of day and light, in every season, in every vantage. We even paid a woman to move out of her apartment at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge and filmed from her living room, time-lapse photography. I'd shoo secretaries away in office buildings to get the exact right place where the two towers separated by, you know, 1,500 feet of span would by this go together, and we had spectacular imagery. And he agreed first to do an interview and later to narrate the film. And more than that, as we came into our first narration session, he said, this writing isn't so good. The woman I was living with, who had become my first wife, and I had worked on the script. She had principally written it, and he just said, you can do better, and gave us on the spot a kind of crash course in writing, and lessons we took to heart and have never forgotten. Well, it's interesting. I was a filmmaker. I wanted my films to be seen in dark rooms with strangers, hundreds of them. I mean, this is the communion, the sacred communion I felt between artist and audience that could take place only in a dark room. And yet, the sources of funding from the humanities groups, both at a state and national level, to other foundations, to arts groups, to even private companies, if they're willing to underwrite, they expected that I give it. And in some cases, the contracts required that I give the films to public television. And I just thought, this is some pact with the devil, but of course it wasn't. In those days, to make a documentary film, you might be shown at a festival with a few hundred people and maybe get some sort of other kind of screenings, but that was it. Suddenly, you were making a deal in which millions of people were seeing the films, and that's exactly what happened. The film was also, The Brooklyn Bridge was also nominated for an Academy Award, and I suddenly found myself having done what I thought was an isolated film in history, realizing I had caught the history bug. I had, in the middle of it, moved out of New York City, where I'd moved to raise the money and to shoot, at least initially, the film, and moved when I realized that I had was becoming a documentary filmmaker, and not only that, one who was going to focus on American history. I'd clearly taken a vow of anonymity and poverty, and I had to move someplace where I could live on for nothing. And my best friend had lived in the area of southeastern Vermont and southwestern New Hampshire, so I moved to this tiny little village of Walpole, New Hampshire, fewer than 3,000 people, only a few hundred in the village itself, into a house that I rented inexpensively, a house I now live in, a house where I have raised 3 kids and made all my films from. And it was the single greatest professional decision I made.